am I? If you're giving me an introduction, I'm going to play this to my mum.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to Writing and Fighting. It is May 1st, 2020, and we are so excited to have two wonderful, esteemed guests coming from UK and Canada here at American University in and yes, I guess a little Zoom. If you have a dog, a noisy spouse, a child, yourself. I love it. But please come back on. All right. So joining us from the UK is John Gooden. And he is a sports commentator, host, producer, and the play-by-play for UFC in UK and Asia. Correct me if I'm wrong. Those are your main?
I take any gig they give me, if I'm honest. But yeah, I've done a little Brazil. I've been to Canada. I kind of say, yeah, I'm the international guy.
All right, Fight Island. We don't know. We don't know.
Maybe.
Yes. Since 2014, he's been working for the UFC, as well as it's aired at BT Sport in UK and ESPN on the US. But you've had a history in all types of combat sports, martial arts, rugby, triathlons. Do you do triathlons? And
I did an Ironman in 2016. So I did a season of triathlon, finished up with an Ironman. Yeah, done that. Played soccer, had a kid, have a wife,
adorable daughter,
a sausage dog. So that's me.
That's John Gooden. Done. All right. And we also have another guest coming in from Canada, Robin Black. I am so excited to have you here because you have a very interesting background in both martial arts and music. And you know, you are a practitioner of Taekwondo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You have had fights in shows, and you've also been calling shows. I have a list here. There's so many. I don't even know where to start. Warrior One, Rec, MMA, CFC, and you also call UFC fights for Canada?
I analyze UFC fights for TSN in Canada. TSN is the broadcast partner here. So it's like ESPN, but in Canada.
ESPN. So there you go. Wonderful. And yes, your background in music, which, you know, I'm fascinated with. What would you call your sound? Is glam rock?
It was pretty crappy, to be honest, but but yeah, sort of a catchy glam rock kind of thing, you know, flashy glam rock kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, Brian, we love to talk about the intersection of art and creativity in martial arts. So we might dig into that as well.
Inevitably, right, with this crowd.
I think martial arts is a pure art form. I think, especially in North America, we position it more heavily as a sport, and it is also that, but I think it very deeply is a pure art form. That's how I analyze it. That's how I study it. That's why I'm obsessed with it. Yeah, I commentate Letway, which is the art of 9 limbs, including the head. You can strike with the head. And I commentate sumo, sambo, jiu-jitsu, karate, taekwondo. I've literally commentated almost every martial art that I've ever heard of in Russia and all over the world. It's the greatest thing in the world. I love it to death. And every single day I have fun and I just do the stuff I love and I feel ridiculously grateful.
Oh my God. Well, what we've loved is, you know, these are students. So they are finding out their passions and their interests and also learning how they go about building a career. Could you both take us quickly how you got into your fields?
John, you go, please.
Thank you. Well, mine's an interesting journey, if I do say so, because it's not been linear by any stretch. So I started with martial arts, practicing martial arts when I was about 7. Judo was the first martial art. I used to compete sort of nationally. And then I got sort of not bored with that, moved on to karate. My uncle is now like a 3rd or 4th dan in Shotokan karate. And I joined with him, did karate for a good few years, was a little bit competitive locally with that. And none of my friends were really into combat sports. So it was always a bit difficult for me to maintain that level of interest when my friends were always doing something else. And soccer, football over here is such a big thing that I always found myself kind of going back to to football and then coming back to combat sports. So the next return was actually to boxing, and I did the amateur, novice amateur, the ABAs here in the UK. With it was at the time I was going to university, my trajectory really was business, and it was just, again, I can't ever get away from combat sports and martial arts. So it was what I was doing on the side. But I think with the pressure and the training, they were tipping me to, like, if you do your uni work through the summer, then you can concentrate on your boxing throughout the rest of the year, and we can look at the Olympics. And I was seduced by the idea of the Olympics, but I was by no way good enough. And I was very early in my journey, only a few fights. So really, you know, the job was more important, and I ended up working in the City of London. This bit's quite interesting in a way, because although I wanted to work in stockbroking and for the banks, I ended up recruiting for banks, which meant I ended up doing a heck of a lot of interviews. I would be interviewing up to 5 people a day sometimes, and I would get an awful lot of interview training as well. And I never knew what a big part of my career that would then become, because everything that I do, whether I'm writing, whether I'm commentating, is based upon a conversation where I've had to uncover a narrative or discover a narrative. So that's always stayed with me, and I very much enjoyed the human element, the human story, that kind of thing. And it was around this time that I'd found some confidence, and it came from somewhere, I'm not too sure where, but I thought that I wanted to be a TV presenter. I saw a bunch of people on the telly box that I thought I could do a better job than what they did in delivering information and making it more fun or whatever. So I ended up throwing the towel in on a pretty decent career financially in the city, and working for free for the BBC at first. So I was working on a couple of like shows. I did a consumer affairs show in the UK, and it really was just to get in the building to network around. But if I'm honest, I've never really been that good at networking. It's as much as I'm certainly not introvert, and I'm confident, but I've just never been very good at knocking on the door or even banging on the door. But at the same time, I haven't expected people for things to land in my lap. I've always felt that if I work hard enough, and if the right opportunity comes up, and I have the necessary skills, then it will happen. But it never did. I was screen testing for some stuff, which was kind of youth TV, but the whole plan for the channel got scrapped. And at the time, I was living in London with some friends, again, super high confidence. But then the money ran out. I was working for free. I got the gig. I think at my first job, I was getting £14,500 a year, which was over half the salary, or less than half the salary that I was getting previously. So I had to move home with mum and dad, and you could see the confidence was starting to tail off a little bit. So I just discovered that I was becoming more and more behind the camera, and it wasn't where I wanted to be. So I went back to the city, but the IT bubble had burst. That didn't work out. I got fired from a job, which I think was a bit unnecessary. I didn't need to be fired. It was the wrong call. And then I joined my dad's company, and that was electrical contracting. I then had to go back to college. I retrained as a tradesman, as an electrician. I took that a little bit further and did like a lighting design course. I became really heavily into the testing side, and I was the QS for the company. And I was really just driving my dad's business for, 10 years with him. We branched out into like solar, home theater, property controls, all of this stuff that you never thought you were going to hear here right now. And all the time that this was going on, I was still engaged in sports, and I went back to combat sports. And this time I'd found mixed martial arts closer to home. And to cut down my story a little bit, I ended up joining a club. I was on my own martial arts journey, was loving it. I had my own ambitions of competing. I was plagued with injuries, unfortunately. And yeah, I only managed to get a couple of amateur fights out. I had a semi-pro fight, which was a thing back in the UK for a time. I had a semi-pro fight lined up, and again, an injury put pay to that. And then I ended up calling fights. My coach put on a show, and on this particular show, I was actually working the corner. I was warming up teammates in the back, things of that nature. But a network had sent a reporter down to do a job, just report on the fights, give it some coverage, and bless her, she did a horrendous job. But she had no knowledge of combat sports, let alone mixed martial arts. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, and she kind of tried to pull the funny side, and I mean, everyone was okay about it, but it was a little bit offensive because this was something that we were all truly passionate about, blood, sweat and tears every day. And now you're kind of, what we would say, sort of taking the mickey out of, you're not taking it seriously. And so I said to my coach, look, you don't know this, but I once harbored this ambition of being a TV guy. Let me do that next time. And he didn't have any sway with this very small network, this digital network that had sent this reporter down. He said, but what we could do, and what I'd like to do with the next show, is have some commentary. So how do you feel about that? And the interesting part about this is when I was at the BBC, and this was 15 years before, maybe 10, certainly between 10 and 15 years before, there was almost like an apprenticeship scheme for commentators, sports commentators. And I remember reading this in the internal communications for the BBC. And I completely rubbished the idea. I looked at it and thought, commentary? No, thank you. I wanted to be in front of the camera. And in the UK, you don't get to see the commentators. They're almost faceless. Even when we were doing MMA stuff, I didn't present and open it. But then really and truly, everyone has stolen the UFC format and they've run with that. But historically and typically in the UK, you don't see the commentators. It is a separate team that present the show. So in my mind, I was never going to get seen. And it wasn't that it wasn't all about being famous or anything like that. I just saw the presenting role as like this holy grail. So I said no to it. And the weird thing was, it was absolutely what I should have said yes to. And it took me a long time to figure it out, but it worked out in the end. And here we are. You know, I ran with it. I started researching athletes differently to everyone else because I was a martial artist. I would look at the card. If there were 3 or 4 fighters from the same team, I'd call up the coach and say, can I join in the session? We're talking amateur fighters here, so it's not like UFC level. It's not like me rolling up with Dan Hardy and Bisping throwing down. No. But no disrespect to these guys. Some of the guys that I was with got really far in Cage Warriors, for example. So I'd go on the mats, and then I earned their respect. But and this is what's quite interesting, actually, Kyle, in that you form a certain relationship when you participate in a class with people. And if you have it, and if you're there for another intention as well, I think it added something. I just immediately got the respect, not because I had any particular skills, because I truly don't, but I think just because I participated and I was willing to, you know, get down in the trenches with everyone else, there was the brotherhood started to exist, and I understood them, and I was interested in their backstory as well as their fight skills. And that's where Graham Boylan, because he owned a gym, he saw this, he identified this. When he got hold of Cage Warriors, I joined up with them. They were the busiest promotion in Europe and the Middle East. And it was timing. You know, I was the busiest guy doing the most high profile shows. And when the UFC came looking to expand, I guess the talent pool was shallow, and I was able to put my hand up and get the gig.
That's so amazing. I love a Brit. You can't say anything without some self-deprecating remark. Yes. But no, thank you for sharing. And it's not just timing. It's and I love John, that you said that you wanted to be in front of the camera and you thought taking commentary was actually keeping you behind it. But I had no idea. I really hadn't thought about that. UFC kind of led this new up front, the people doing analysis at Cage Side. We want to see them. We want to hear from them. So thank you. And I'd love to hear, Kyle, what your thoughts on that. And John, I wanted to tell you that I talked with Anna Isa. She does the color for Brazil in UFC. And she talked about, because she had to kind of fight her way with, kind of doing camera work. And they would sometimes put, this is just to show you, gender is not even an issue, because they would put a male in front of her who had no idea what was going on, because, they thought that was the look that Brazil wanted to see. So it's interesting that you had the opposite, where they wanted a female in front of the camera, even though she did not know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kyle, would you want to come in and talk about?
Yeah. I thought that was an awesome introduction. I'll resist just asking you questions about electricity because I do have some problems at my house right now, and I didn't know I could get that expertise. But the thing that fascinated me was the point that you made, and you linked up to my own research about the way you built community through training and rolling with people. And one of the arguments I make in my research to other academics is that if you're studying a physical practice, you get something through experiencing it yourself. So in my own research, I've trained in different MMA gyms for about 5 years, because I don't think you can understand it without doing that. But what I'm wondering is, how does that translate to your role as a commentator? Is it just that you get access and stories that you would not otherwise, because they wouldn't trust the random professional who goes into the gym and wants to hear things? Or does it actually, how does that come out when you're watching a fight, when you're talking about the fight? What do you get from not just watching someone train, but feeling them catch you in a submission or working through a striking combination with them?
Yeah, I do think you get currency, but I think that you'll see from the profile of John Anik, Brendan, and many others, even Mike Goldberg before, you have respect for people as broadcast professionals, and they're not expected to have taken hits to be in that role. There is quite a defined separation, but I think that's a little bit of a USP on my side, because it's not about me, but what it does allow me to do is go a little bit deeper. I can walk further so that I can then get the very best out of the color commentator. I can really help them flex their muscles. And something that came up that we were talking about there with the UFC set up the formats. What also I believe has happened is Mike Goldberg set up how people thought the play-by-play should be done for MMA broadcasts. Now, in the UK, it was different anyway, because the sport's at a very different time to what it is in the US, even now, which is something I'm sure we'll come on to at some point, but the recognition's not there, the understanding's not there. But also, I'm very different to Mike Goldberg. So I would have to, like, I wear the bow tie. I dress up super smart. I do not that I have anything against the shaved head at all, or tattoos. I'd love, if I finally get the time, I'd love to cover my back in body arts. But I have, like, I'm lucky that I probably don't have a certain look, and so that's why people don't assume that I fight. But it makes me maybe a little bit more palatable for a UK audience who don't want to see such a macho look. But then the Americans probably don't like it in another way. But Mike Goldberg set it up in such a way that it wasn't, and this is no slight on him because we all have our strengths, but he wasn't very technical. But what that meant was you had the play-by-play became different. If you watch any other sports, if you're watching soccer, whether you take a throw-in, a free kick, whether it's a long ball, a short ball, a penalty, the play-by-play guy covers all of that. The analysis, the analyst, the color commentator then layers that. So why do I have to back out of commentary just because the fight goes to the ground? And what? Yeah, no. And what I've now managed to do is by consistently being on the mat, or trying to consistently be on the mat, or be in the gym, it is a language, and it's like a vocabulary. And also the beats. Like if I don't train 3 times a week in jiu-jitsu, I'm getting caught in crazy stuff. The 3rd time in that week, you're not catching me in that kimura every time. I'm seeing it earlier. And I actually approach commentary very much with my martial arts head on. And it's the same. I can see things happening, which allows me to then lean on Dan and lead him and open that door wide so that he can talk about that, why it's worked, why it hasn't, rather than him having to explain what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm always trying to get better at. And that's why I drag myself to class. I mean, MMA's a bit more challenging for me now these days. These kids are so young, strong, fast. And I've been hitting the head a lot over the years. So I'd now just really do no gi and gi. But I still have the itch to get punched in the face and hit someone back as well. But I honestly think it does help with the gym vocabulary and the sharpness. But I don't think you need to do the job.
Fascinating. I want to get more into this dance that you call between the color play by play. But Robin, can we hear your background? I
Sure.
A little different. Just get
So a couple of things. One, I am the color guy. So John and I hope I get to work with John one day. I really, truly do. I just love his work and I love the way he thinks. And he's such an organized thinker, which allows why John is so good is because he allows you to color outside the lines because he builds lines, right? And not every play-by-play man does that. But so when I was listening to John's story, my first thought was how different my path is, but then my next one was how incredibly similar it was in the sense that it's totally nonlinear, that there's incredible setbacks and curveballs and weird shit that happens that you then adapt to and later on realize are important parts of the path. That from a structural standpoint, you're basically kind of looking at choices as you move forward. Something works or doesn't work often leads you in a particular direction. Very nonlinear. As a little kid, I was a gymnast, very, very small kid, and I became obsessed with how people move, which led me to martial arts, and then I was obsessed with martial arts my whole life. And very curious about how and why we move the way we do and what it means and how the brain propels it and the physiology and the emotion connected to it and what movement feels like and all of this kind of stuff. And there wasn't really a lot. I was a reasonably intelligent kid. My father has a PhD. My mother is very smart. My brothers are smart. I was reasonably intelligent, but really scattered. I wasn't passionate or hardworking about almost anything except for art and movement and martial arts. Really, also like John, I don't really get networking. It feels weird to me. Over time, I have realized that every hour spent trying to massage somebody up the chain from you is an hour not spent on your craft and suiting the audience. So I studied martial arts as a kid. I was a musician in my 20s, and I sung and danced and did high kicks and tight pants with eye makeup on. It was really fun. And we traveled. What's that? Yeah, we traveled around the world playing music, and I learned a lot about sort of building art and sharing it and building an audience and connecting to an audience. And I made a lot of mistakes. We had a very big digital audience. We had a very big, real humans who loved our band. And we spent way more time thinking about demo tapes and record companies. And that's a big error in retrospect. And it was one that later, and now I do the opposite. 95% of my time is spent thinking about the audience, and very, very little of my time is ever spent thinking about an executive or a producer or somebody up the chain who I have to send just the right email to get them to put me in some role that they created. I have no interest in that. I no longer go and find how the structure presents the role and then fill it. I create what I want and then find the way it fits into the world. So but that ain't easy. On the path of that, you're going to have lots of conflict, and a lot of it's going to be with yourself. A lot of it's going to be, well, I want this. Well, I should do it this way. And so over time, I the long and the short of it is I had kind of a seizure from drinking too much and doing too much drugs while in England on tour. And I went back and I immediately was like, you got to get some shit together in your life. So I started doing martial arts again, which I hadn't done for years, and training, you know, became every day real fast, and then became twice a day real fast. And I got a blue belt in Nova Unao in jiu-jitsu in like 7 weeks, I think, because I was a martial artist all my life. I understand how to move the body, and I trained twice a day, 2 days a week, and 3 times a day, 3 days a week. So I was training about 17 or 18 times a week. And then immediately it was more and more. And then immediately I was like, I'm literally, I'm a bit of a fragmented thinker, my apologies, but I am currently 15 years into my 5-year plan of becoming the color commentator for the UFC. And I really like how it's going. 15 years into it. But I am almost immediately was like, this is what I'm going to do. And this is how I'm going to do it. And I don't give a fuck what it takes or what the process is. I'll learn as I go. And I knew without question, the only way somebody was going to allow a guy, no matter how obsessed I was and how pure my love of martial arts was, there was no way somebody was going to let a guy who wore eye makeup and had purple hair and wore tight pants singing in a rock band commentate. So I figured I better fight one time. So I trained like 11 times a week. I lived as a professional fighter. I worked as a hairdresser, and I would work 2 or 3 hours doing haircuts, go and train, work 2 or 3 hours more, go and train, and then work more. Took all the money, put it back into training and whatever else I could do. And I trained as a professional athlete for about 8 years, but for about 2 years, and then I fought. I lost, and I thought, okay, well, I'll fight till I win. And then I won, and then I was like, well, I'll fight till I even my record, and then I'll fight till I experience a second round, and then I'll fight, and I just kept going because, as has been said, and John said it, and others have, and Kyle mentioned it. I don't care what you want to analyze or what you want to develop expertise or mastery in. 90% of the information exists only within the experience. There are a lot of people who say they analyze, you know, brain surgery or martial arts, who have not done brain surgery or martial arts. They actually are analyzing the experience of watching something. That's not the same thing. Yeah. To analyze something, you must live it and do it. And as John mentioned, you start to really connect to the culture and the art and the essence of it, and it becomes a part of your life. And then you feel like you've earned the right to be able to talk about it, and you've earned the right to be able to. And now now I don't really have a job. I analyze martial arts and study it and commentate it and share what I find and build things around it, to write stories about it and whatever. I just express myself about what I learn every day. And I make a fair bit of money doing it, and I have a whole bunch of different clients. Bellator is one of my big ones. The World Lightweight Championship, Eris Martial Arts, I commentate in Africa and France. It's on hold. Most all of these are. Bare knuckle boxing in London. I go there about every 6 weeks, or I was going there about every 6 weeks to commentate that. South Asia. All of this, I started to understand that I was not there to figure out how to fill a role that someone else created. I was there to follow my path and continue to study something, find something of value to the audience, and then figure out how to share it. So the non-linear aspect continues, and even more so now. I have no interest in filling a role designed by a producer who does not do martial arts. I don't have any fucking interest in it. But if I continue to grow my skills and continue to have an audience that cares, somebody will allow me to do it my way. And that's how I need to do it now. And I've never been happier in my whole life than I have the last couple of years that I understood that. I'm so grateful that I figured that it was about 3 years ago that I started to understand that I wasn't trying to figure out how to get hired for a job or to win the audition or to figure out how to do a role the way it's expected to be done. I was on a journey to figure out some interesting shit and figure out how to share it with the audience.
That's such amazing advice. I think Gabby, my student here, but all of us need to know this, because I think a lot of young people, you start to, as you move through college, you start to think, oh shit, I got to get a job and I got to figure out who I am. And so then you start thinking, I will I want to please this person. I want to please my boss, and I will become what they want me to be.
Yeah, that's right.
And start worrying, like, how am I going to do in my review? Oh God, and it's this state also. That's when I think you hate your work, because you're not creating something. You're trying to just, please and do work for someone else. And
you have to figure out what the actual goal really is. My original goal with the 5-year plan was sit next to Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg at the time. Now it would be John Anik, who I love, and do this job. And I was so unhappy in certain chunks of trying to do that thing. I met people within a large business organization that thought very different than I did, that had very specific roles, that created formulas that had to be executed against in particular ways where you stand away. I had people say, you should take voice training to sound more like a broadcaster, all the things that made me feel really weird and inauthentic. And I thought, am I supposed to do these things to achieve a goal that I set without really understanding what it was? Or should I use these things as signals to go in different directions and explore things in my own way? And it's very hard to do that. I'm not gonna Gary V it and just say, hey, it's easy, fucking go for it. Like, it's difficult. It is emotionally challenging to decide you're going to play drums your own way, or be a mechanic your own way, or commentate fighting. There are structured formulas through which these things are currently done. If you don't agree with them and you think you have a different way, but the truth, it's better, because if I did shoehorn myself into these more structured positions, I would be having conflict with the people above me, and I would be so certain I was right, and so would they, and then we'd have conflict. And in the end, John mentioned getting fired. They ended up cutting an entire department of a place that I worked, and partly because we ended up seeing things so differently. I was sure digital was the future. I was sure the way that I was seeing it to go was the future. They were sure it was a different way, and ultimately they didn't just fire me. They cut our entire department. And these are the conflicts that you will face. So the great thing is, today, you don't need any jobs. You can build a thing where you make $200 a month on YouTube and $50 a month on Instagram, and you have a part-time job, and you sell t-shirts that say Bink and whatever. And the next thing you know, you make $200,000 a year, and you do it your own way, and you're on your own journey. And that's an inevitability as long as you get better every day and you keep pursuing things for their own purpose, for joy and for curiosity.
Can I layer a couple of Robin's points there, just to give a different example? And I think the overarching word that came to mind was authenticity. And it's something that's been that I've not recognized as much until recently. And there is definitely a pursuit of authenticity in my work. The caveat for me personally is I don't always know best. And actually I work with some really good, so actually there's a couple of, or a few excellent producers that I work with, and I go after their opinion a lot. Haven't always worked with those people, but they've given me direction, which I can still be authentic, but actually for the audience, and this is very specific now. So Gabby, be careful with what I'm saying here, because we have to appeal to our audience. Authenticity, you have to be authentic, but also you have to speak to your audience as a broadcaster. So you have to get within those roles. And here's a very practical thing. Now, a lot of presenters will talk about when you hold it, like, what do you do with your hands? It sounds ridiculous. What do you do with your hands? I tell you what you do with your hands, whatever you do with your hands when you're speaking normally. And I'm doing it now. I speak with my hands a lot. If you ever see me delivering the lines on a broadcast, I'm holding a card and I'm like punching the air to kind of get emphasis out, because I don't have the biggest lungs in the world. And when I'm commentating, there's pictures sometimes of me doing this just because it helps me. It's natural for me. If I stop that, it will either manifest somewhere else, or my projection and my performance will not be as effective or efficient. So you have to let it be. You have to Bruce Lee that stuff, it is authentic. And it was just to layer your point, Robin, and from a personal experience. And and just give it some different context.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I just think that for me, because I'm in such an unstructured environment right now, and there are times where I'm structured. So I go and I work for a company, and I'll sit at the thing, and I'll wear the headset, and I'll commentate the fights. And I have to understand what the belief system of what I can and can't do is. I don't have to agree that it's true. I personally think the biggest flaws, whether we're talking about Bellator or the NFL or whatever, the biggest flaws are the formulas themselves. And the reasons that they exist is because when you make 500 football shows a year, or you make up 40 UFCs a year, you must create formulas so that they can be reproduced. But I believe those formulas are the weak point. Now, I can't fight that with my boss at Bellator or somebody at the UFC or TSN that I work with, or somebody, but I can still understand in my mind and question everything over time. That if we got to just start again and said, okay, from the ground up, let's make a show, most people will make it look very, very much like the UFC or the NFL or the Oscars or whatever. But why the fuck would you do that? Why couldn't you on what planet do we think this is the best way? It's the way. Therefore, the Oscars or any other award show should all look like this. If you had a talk show that you were starting tomorrow, the very first fucking thing I would do is put the desk on the other side. Because why the fuck is the desk there? And it's always there. It's always there. It's always been there. You think it needs to be there. And somebody would say, oh, no, people will freak out. Well, good. Because now that's the nature of what we need to do now. We need people to take notice of the fragmenting of the structures themselves in these things. And in many things that are winning, it is a change in the complete structure of it. I know that's probably off topic of what we're talking about today, but I mean, why would you shoot every single time the wide open, and then we're here in New York City, and then a shot of the Statue of Liberty, and then shots of the New York traffic, and we got us a great football game tonight between this team and this team, then show the stats. You're just doing that because you've always done it, and the infrastructure through which that is done is producers, directors, the people like that. They've created jobs that are very, very structured, and now you have this incredibly structured thing. The internet and the ability, even just this Zoom chat doesn't look like the news. We aren't talking like the news. We are thinking differently. We're sharing different ideas because we don't have the structure, right? In most cases, the deepest flaws in the product or the presentation or the production or a television program or anything is in the structures themselves. They're old and they're outdated. We were talking about commentary. Commentary started with baseball and you couldn't see anything. Mm-hmm. So somebody was listening on the radio and they'd say, okay, this guy comes to bat. He's this guy. He did he hit the ball. The ball went, he's running to first. Yeah. Why the fuck? And then they showed baseball and they didn't have that and people missed it. But we don't need to say he hit the ball and he's running to first. We can see that with our eyes. So a lot of even commentary, what John and I do, a lot of the times we do what people did before us. We don't always stop and go, does this make sense in a world where Joe Rogan smokes weed on television with his friends swearing and more people watch it? Are we doing the right thing just because our smart structural producers say so? We can't pretend we don't live in a world where that audience sees that. It's absurd of us to do so. Or that audience sees their favorite shows on Showtime or HBO. People are swearing and stuff, and then we have to act a particular way. It's a very old television way to do it, right? So these are just some of the things I think about a lot.
This is fascinating to me. And John, please come in here too, because we do carry over a lot of tradition, especially from the pugilistic boxing world. We've had students say, why do we have ring girls? And not that I respect those women, everyone deserves and nothing, but, we don't really need them, but it was before we had the technology to show it. Another thing, like judging, that is a carryover, right? Our 10-point system. Could we rethink that because of other issues? I think if we go to combat sports, boxing, we have 12 rounds. It used to be 15. The problem is, we were having draws, we had an odd number that would help with that. There are some things that we do have ingrained, and it's our fear that I think we fear that the audience can't handle a shift. Is that kind of what we worry about in terms of changing these things?
You see, I don't 100% agree on some levels, because I feel that it's not just processes that always are inherited. And the UFC, for example, is young, and I've recently been going back through the archive for some work that I've done, and it has evolved. You know, they have changed things. They've changed the walkouts. They've changed the positioning of where the stand-ups are done. And I would believe that Brendan, John, and I do things differently from one another, from Mike Goldberg, and the UFC have embraced that. The point that Robin made that actually was very interesting is that Joe's what Fight Companion show that Joe does, because he's such a powerful individual, does attract more viewers. Does that mean that his product is visually more appealing, or the content's better? Or is it just because Joe Rogan has such a powerful presence that he then engages that audience, rather than the commentary that I might be on sites? So it's difficult, and I do think there is an element of storytelling, and it's funny actually. A side note: I've just gotten off of a call with the former, let me see, what was he? The executive producer at Vice, who used to run the Noisy department, and he's produced a whole bunch of stuff. And we were talking about how the polished product that he used to work at MTV before then, everything was a lot more polished. And he goes to Vice, and these guys were like guerrilla journalists, and they were having handhelds, and they're getting numbers, and it's impact, and it's emotional, and it was really intimate stuff. So I don't disagree in that sense, but I do think there's a time and a place where you can flex the beautiful 4K lens, and you can take a nice view of things and paint that picture. And maybe we don't always do it brilliantly. And I've been called like a travel journalist at times, because I do the international shows, when you go into a certain area and, well, that bridge there was built in 1863. But it's kind of weird. It is weird, but at the same time, you should be stamping it with some nice pictures of where you are to give context. But have we figured it out yet? Maybe not. Are we always looking to improve and evolve? Yes. The UFC, I have to say, I do have open ears, and my direct boss is always looking for me to give him feedback. And I spoke to Anik yesterday, and we spoke about the kind of uncomfortable nature of how we introduced the ring girls, the Octagon girls. And he said that he stole my line, and I didn't even think about this. But as the Octagon girl would come out, I just used to say, "Thank you, Carly," rather than "Beautiful Carly Baker there." And John said, "Perfect. I'm just going to thank them." Exactly. But I never really thought about it too hard, because I didn't want to come across like sleazy. Check out Carly today. Look what she's. But she's also my friend, so I don't want to ignore her. And I know I don't want to be too British either. And it's just, so it is funny how we do have these pillars to what we have. But I do also think that the UFC and the people, particularly Dana and Craig, who is the head of production there, those guys look at how bright the lamps are, how loud the music is. Dana is genuinely interested in that stuff. And that sort of warms my soul to know that the boss is interested to that detail. I actually think I'm sympathetic to him. Like, geez, your head must be so full if you're worrying about that detail, but I have to respect it. And 100% I do. So I'm not disagreeing with you, Robin, but I do sometimes think that those reps and with the different minds that come in, but I can't help but get away from the points that you're making there. It is inherited, but then again, you've had great minds that have created that. It's
well, to Nancy's point, if we take it away from the singular example of a production of a show and move it to fighting itself, like you're saying, Nancy, a lot of the things are the things we've always done. Something is, again, this is also in the production end of it, but this is to all sports. Somebody once came up with the idea of calling the stats the tail of the tape. Yeah. Some one person said, and here we'll bring the tail of the tape, and then they put that thing up. If you told that person that fucking 65 years later, we were just gonna still use their thing, and we were all just gonna go, well, I guess that's the best idea we're ever gonna come up with. That's it forever. And we do that. And we don't just do that with martial arts. We don't just do that with television production. We don't just do that with mixed martial arts or whatever. We humans do that. That's what we do. This is a valuable idea, not just when we're talking about our passion or our job, but this applies to everything. Why on earth do we paint our houses a particular way that most everybody, and yes, to John's excellent point, it does change. You do see changes, but there are small shifts, tiny shifts that are made, and to your point, slightly out of fear. We are afraid that and we should be, if I run the NFL or if I have a big job in the Oscars or the UFC or Bellator, whatever we're talking about, if I have a big job in there, and I'm the guy who says, hey, I got an idea. The clock that we use should be full screen and just kind of see-through. We all might fucking love that idea, but that guy's never going to bring it up, because if it's wrong, it's too big. He's going to lose his job. He's going to lose his job. It's going to affect his family. And that's more important to him than making some small, weird innovation he's pretty sure would be cool, but so that's the nature. The bigger the corporation gets, it's true of Nike, it's true of Coca-Cola, the bigger it gets, the more structure there is. It is important, and we're all very lucky with whatever job we have, if we do respect our producer, Dana. I fucking love Dana, and Craig, who John's talking about. These guys are smart people. You're lucky to have smart people there. But the bigger the structure, the more the formulas. The more the formulas, the less innovation. And there's 1,000 metaphors. The bigger the boat, the harder it is to turn, right? Yeah. But today you can get, and this is how I manage this, and I think how John does too, and how all of us do. If we got little innovative tendencies that we want to do, we do that in our own platforms. We do that. We create a YouTube channel where we can do that. And then I go and I do put on a suit, and I do show up at Bellator or TSN or any of these jobs, and I do, within reason, execute against what they want. But this is what I see today. The bigger that you can, of an audience that you can build, that proves that you care about, you nurture them, and you don't figure out how to feed them. You figure out how to do something meaningful that people will eventually join you in the quest of. If you do that enough, eventually you have enough influence that when you go in and somebody says, okay, well, we're gonna get John or Robin and they're gonna come in, you actually have either some currency or some leverage or an audience or some proven truth that your weird ideas are worth, exploring seriously, and you can bring that in. And to me, it's different for everybody. I'm just still that makeup wearing punk rocker who just doesn't want some fucking boss to tell me what to do, and that's a weakness, but it's also the strength that's kind of led me into figuring out how to do it my own way, that I can build it my way without having to do it a dry way or somebody else's structure. And that can be done. It's there. It can be done.
This is so great. Does anyone have a hard stop at 12:30? Because I know we're going to go past. So I'd love to keep going, and please chime in with questions. I definitely want to talk about the current state of what we're doing with all sports, and also UFC, which is hopefully going to be picking up here next weekend for you guys, for you to have your jobs, but also I totally want to respect your safety and everything. I have one question before that though, because when we get in that, we're going to probably stay there. It may be kind of controversial. What do you think of current fighters on the UFC, rosters coming in and doing color? Is that kind of at all, they have something invested, especially if they're calling fighters that they are also in the same weight class?
John's worked with some of these guys, yes?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with it. And it adds some drama. Felder is on the current roster. He's had plenty of interactions. I was just going back watching some Justin Gaethje footage. I think he had beaten James Vick and he called for, not very kind. He said, I'd love to fight Tony Ferguson. I hear that you'd like to fight me. I'd like to do, and then it was very amicable. It was like a gentleman's agreement, if you like. It might make it, it opens that individual up to criticism when they're commentating on fights in their weight division. So they've just got to be cognizant of the fact when they're calling the fights that they might get called out for it. But really and truly, you're going to get called out on it anyway. Whether you're fighting now or not, Dan and I get accused of being biased towards UK or European fighters. So people will always find an angle to critique your work. But I don't see a problem with it if you do good work, if you can give a new lease of life, if you can add some value, then why not? Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've been through it. Like, that's the most important thing. So I worked with a guy, be unfair for me to name check him, but everyone will know. I worked for a long time in Cage Warriors, and I loved the guy that I worked with, and the chemistry that we had. He was very much a grappling enthusiast, and he had such a beautiful vocabulary, and the way that he would phrase things, I learned so much. And even when we were doing like our voiceover stuff before, very, very highly intelligent guys, an architect as well. But I made the walk to a fighting arena more than what he had. So I had nowhere to go when it comes to that. And that's really important. When you're at the upper echelons of fighting, when you're looking at Conor McGregor with all of those light bulbs and lenses and microphones and the build up, unless you've fought at a high level, how can you get close to comprehending that? So you need your team that are going to be in that broadcast. You need them to have been in a situation, at least get close to that, so that it allows someone like me to say, what is he going through? Can you articulate what he's going through? Because as Robin said earlier, it would be through another lens. But if you ask Daniel Cormier, what is he going through? He's run that so many times with John Jones, with Gustafsson. You know, he knows the drill, even though Conor McGregor's the eyeballs are probably greater in numbers. So that's the thing that I would say where I was really looking forward to going to the UFC and working with Dan, because he'd walked it. He'd fought for the world title against George St. Pierre. Mm-hmm. So I could go to places in that broadcast that I couldn't with Josh. And that's no slight on him at all. It was just another area that I actually think is very important for a UFC broadcast.
Yeah, my thoughts are it's a show ultimately, right? You're making a television show. So the things that outrage people, and if we're just hanging out, just all of us, and we're chatting, somebody says, what do you think of this guy saying this thing? We could be like, oh God, that just drives me crazy. But that's good for the purpose of your television program or your product. If, like Stephen A. Smith said a bunch of stuff about Cowboy, and why were people offended? Why was I offended? Sorry, that disappeared for a second. Why was anybody offended? Well, because we don't usually say that about fighters. And why don't you say that about fighters? Because fighters don't, sorry, I just had to plug this in. Fighters don't say that because they've done it. No fighter would say, oh my God, that guy quit, because they know what the meaning of that really is. And they know that the mental challenge of getting ready to fight, you deal with that every single fight. So the idea that, oh my God, Cowboy Cerrone didn't want to be there 2 weeks out. George St. Pierre didn't want to be there 22 times, and he won 20 of them. It's part of the process. It's a normal part of the process. So of course it's offensive that Stephen A. Smith said that, but that's good for the product. It creates conflict and it creates controversy. And I'm Canadian and John is British, and that's not our thing as much as it is in America. But in America, conflict and controversy helps sell your product. So you look at the root of it. The root is we are trying to get people to watch our thing. And if somebody says something that makes half the audience mad and half the audience disagree with them, That's a good thing. And that exists as a truth outside of what we think of that truth. So from that perspective, I think it's great if, if somebody if somebody says something about John Jones in the broadcast for that purpose. As a martial arts purist and as a sort of an artist, I find it weird, or it might bother me, but that's irrelevant to the purpose. The purpose of it is to make people watch your fights, and it does that.
Yeah.
I've got a question that might transition into the question that you're going to ask next, Nancy. I hope this makes sense. So it seems like John and Robin take different approaches to this, but mixed martial arts, the UFC occupies a different space than most sports do. And it's in this 30-year period, we've seen this rapid transition where the UFC went from being this violent subculture, this spectacle that a few people knew about, that people were excited about, but that mainstream audiences were not exposed to. And now it has become this mainstream thing that looks more and more like a sport. And I'm wondering, as commentators, as people who introduce this thing to a larger audience, how do you deal with that? Because even in your conversation already, Robin, you're referring to it as an art, right? You're saying, I don't see it as a sport, I see it as an art. John, you're specifically in a role of basically saying, we're going to make it compete with other sports in the UK, right? And it's, as you were saying, it's a little bit newer in the UK in some ways than it is in the United States. So how do you deal with that tension where you want it to be a sport, but if it becomes too much of a sport, it loses something? So what do you do with that?
Yeah, it is funny, and an intern, like I've grappled with the notion a few times, because we have the IMAF, the International Mixed Martial Arts Federation, which has campaigned for mixed martial arts to be part of the Olympics. What do I think about that? Because really, in order for it to satisfy an Olympic committee, you're going to probably dilute it with lots of pads and taking out certain targets. And one of my big things about my amateur success was amateur success. I had a couple of fights, but I truly didn't feel like I'd satisfied myself, because the rule sets were just diluted. It just wasn't a pro. I wasn't able to use all the tools that I was training. So I just didn't feel satisfied. So I get that. But at the same time, a bit like we want an industry to flourish. And sometimes as much as, yes, you do have to just comply to a certain extent. You have to go back and forth to make things palatable. There are some crazy rules that we still have, the 12 to 6 elbows, for example. What's the difference there to, I'd rather take one of those than I would a shin kick from Edson Barboza, but it's just how it looks. And I understand that. I understand why we do that. And we have to sometimes consider human nature, popular culture, so that we can still go. It's like pick your battles, that they are small concessions that you have to make in order for a sport to flourish, so that more people can enjoy it, more people can earn from it. And I'm really talking about the athletes, although, selfishly, it's nice to be able to earn a living as a broadcaster in this. But really, we're talking about one of the hardest grinds. And if you make it so marginal, then the money won't be there, the acceptance won't be there, but maybe the purism will. And maybe the two can exist. They can coexist, but I don't think those people will have long careers. Whereas we're getting to a space where, and I don't think the UFC get a lot of credit for this, it is a sport that, certainly in the UK, everything else grows, right? Grassroots. The UFC underpins everything. We don't have that, like the sport of England don't recognize mixed martial arts. The UFC have to help fund federations and drug testing programs and rule sets, etc., in order for the sport to flourish internationally. Whereas other sports get local funding and support and infrastructure, and it just hasn't happened that way. And it's such a reverse to what we're used to, but they've done that because they've thought about how to make it acceptable, and small changes here and there. And that's kind of how we've gotten to where we are, where it has opened massive doors for everyone.
Very true. Robin, do you have anything to add? Or because
on the idea
I might have a question.
Yeah, please.
So, hey guys, there's a lot to be made of. I really love the conversation about format and the evolution of format. And I think about also when you relate that to the scale and the scope, and John, what you were just speaking to in terms of the sort of ecosystem that's necessary to foster the entirety of it, right? You know, I think what's really interesting to me is, you know, if you imagine watching NFL football or something as established as that, but every season the players are wildly better and wildly more talented. You know what I mean? Like every season you're like, oh my God, holy shit. Like what is happening now? Like this, I didn't even know that was possible. So MMA is like this, right? Like where it's, you know, this, if you think about the NFL broadcasters and typical sports broadcasters, that language has evolved very slowly as the monolith of the sport has evolved. You guys are right in the middle of sort of trying to wrestle with newfound tradition as best as it can be established, maybe perhaps more to John, what you were sort of speaking of in terms of, you know, how you approach it. And then Robin, you know, you are obviously able to sort of straddle both worlds in terms of working in a formalized environment that's a little slower to iterate. And then you have, you know, your own platforms and ways that you really start to kind of branch out and connect it. But I guess I'm just curious ultimately, and maybe this ties in a little bit to the writing aspect of your class, Nancy, but in terms of just language and linguistics, and I know, Robin, you've talked a lot about this and it's been great, but really for both of you guys, what I'm interested in is, as comparatively the monolith of NFL broadcasting and terminology, and then Robin, what you're talking about, even in MMA, we're bringing in things that are old boxing, you know, tail of the tape type of things. But ultimately, the language, you're having to evolve the language so fast because the sport itself and the fighters themselves and the act of the fighting and everything and the rule sets and everything are evolving just wildly. So how do you, from just a purely linguistic standpoint, sort of foster or cater to that, or what awareness are you sort of carrying with you with respect to just language?
So I do think about this a lot. It's like if martial arts is my major, communication in my own non-existent education that I've built for myself and how I look at things, language and communication and media would be my second interest. And I view it as a martial art. I view it as changing and growing and finding limits and then finding ways through them. And again, when we were talking about, I was saying, you know, about 3 years ago, I had a lot of like real tension as I was I was finding these plateaus, not just in how to do work and the limitations of roles that existed already, but how to express ideas. And I started to read a lot about how to enhance language and how to look at things in a different way. And what I started to find is that certain paradigms will dominate your way of thinking. So in baseball, everybody talks about statistics, because at the time of baseball's kind of hottest time, it was all stats based. Everybody started getting obsessed with stats. And so it became a stats sport. And fighting is young, but in fighting, in particular, Joe, who is a good friend, and I love and admire him, Joe has such a strong way of speaking, and it was different. What made Joe so good in the early broadcasts and the language of fighting, and as a part that laid the foundation of it, was he was so different than boxing. And as John mentioned, the roles were weird. John is very much the true play-by-play man because he knows the sport. Early on, Joe kind of took that over. And then Mike Goldberg's role started to become, you know, the setup man, you know, corn nuts, teeth, like it's all over. He started to become that. John is very much a play-by-play man with structure and knowledge, and he can lay it out and, as he said, tee up the guy. The roles as they are supposed to be is John says what, and I say how and why. That's how John and I are supposed to work together. He says, what is happening? And I say how and why. And it's really that simple. But the how and the why is where I started to feel trapped. And I started to feel trapped when we would have a conversation and somebody would say, this guy's got crazy power and he's got a crazy chin. And then people would literally say to me, what happened here? Did that guy have a lot of power or did he have a weak chin? And I realized that it was our language that was limiting our ability to rationalize and express what happened. And it was because we were trapped in these paradigms. Literally, show after show, doesn't matter what fighting show it is on planet Earth. Somebody will say, what about this guy's striking? Well, his striking, yada, yada, yada. But what about this guy's grappling? Well, his grappling. But John, myself, everybody who does it, all the fighters who commentated that still do that, they know it isn't even barely trained or thought of that way anymore. It's thought of as one long fabric of martial arts. That's what Dominic Cruz is training right now, is training the big picture. So we need a language that allows that. And literally for me, I had to start studying a number of things. One is learn to resist the desire, the natural human urge to jump to a conclusion. Like just resist it and resist our natural human urge to form a permanent opinion. Because by doing that's called a negative capability. By looking at something, and so we are fragile creatures, humans. We need to feel like we know. And when people would tell me my job 5 and 10 years ago, they'd say, you're the expert, tell them who's gonna win. I'm like, I am the expert, and I know that in truth, we don't know, and here are the reasons why. That's the truth. But you want me to take a strong opinion and say, this guy will win because the takedown defense is too good, and he'll knock this guy out, he's got knockout power in both hands. I'm fucking lying. You want me to lie to these people. And then because the role of the other guy, well, you know, this guy's got too good a footwork, and that creates a narrative and it creates excellent television in 2012. And so we do that. And the only way that could be broken through is I had to literally resist the urge to do that. John probably never says this, and I never say this, but when somebody hits somebody, you say, oh my God, big right hand, you might as well have said nothing, because that's what everybody at home did. Now, if your goal is to connect to the person on the couch who's already thinking that, rather than to provoke them to think something else. What's that?
Unless it's a radio broadcast.
Unless it's radio, exactly, like baseball, like early baseball, right?
You're absolutely right. You're 100% right.
And so you have to pioneer your language by resisting. Humans are filled with mirror neurons. The reason we exist here is some of our primate ancestors saw one stick down an anthill, pull up ants and eat it, and then we all copy it. We have the tendency to do that. When Joe was so innovative with his language, people literally started to copy it unknowingly. What they wanted to copy was his individuality. They wanted to copy, he's different, that's why he's good. Instead, they were like, he's good, I should be like that. And it's not purposeful, it's not a knock against, it's just what we do as humans, unless we consciously, unless we consciously seek to not do it. And so years ago, I had to start doing that. It was very difficult. I'm doing very well now. I love, like, my work is really fun and it's just very smooth. But three or 4 years ago, there was so much pushback as I tried to speak about things differently. People didn't want that. He's got power in both hands and he's got a great chin. That's what they wanted. Anything different, I got a lot of pushback. I don't get it as much anymore at all. And I found an audience that is interested in that, sort of an early adopter audience. But knockout power in both hands. Nobody has power in their hand, and power is not something you have, it's something you create. So right there, we have created through language, because the nature of television, it's also the confines. John has 40 seconds to speak, and then he tosses it to me and I have 20. So we start to shape things in ways that simplify it. When somebody said somebody had a great chin in boxing in the 40s, they probably first talked about their ability to take a punch, the structure of their neck, how well they were moving with it, how light on their feet, how were they relaxed, all of these aspects. And then we shortened it to, man, this guy's got a hell of a chin. It was a slang. But later that slang becomes a fact, it starts being treated as a factual thing because language changes. So now people hear that and I'm sure it happens to John, it happens to me all the time. People like, so who's got the better chin? It's like, that's not a real fucking thing. That's 11 different things that all are unrelated, all have different structures, and we only say it because we only had 15 seconds to say it, but we did a disservice because now they think that's a thing. And of course it is a thing in the sense that over time, you don't take a punch as well, but it's not a thing as in a score in a video game. So it is does this matter for sport or fighting or a Beyonce concert or the Oscars or football? Not really, because we're all just enjoying ourselves. But it matters if you're looking at how to live your life and how to change. When you change the words you use, you change your thinking. You start to see things in different ways. And that is a valuable thing in fucking everything. Make you a better dad, a better friend, a better brother, a better sister, a better worker, you know, a nicer person. Like, seeing that the words we use are not reflections of our thoughts are reflections of the language that we access. And so you have to really grow that over time, and you have to have the freedom to do it, which you don't always have. You know, the bigger the structure, maybe the less you will have that flexibility until you earn some type of leverage to do it. But that's the beauty of being able to go on LinkedIn or go on, you know, a Zoom group or Facebook or whatever. You can now experiment with these ideas that will make you better at your job.
I love how you respect the craft, Robin, because that's what it is. It's respecting the craft. And I was looking down, I wasn't being rude. So I don't know. So it's not, I'm not going to, it's not showing very well. You see there's this, right? This is phrases, words, bits of language. I'm still scrolling. I update that every day. I'll like.
Let's tell us one. We'll add to our language here.